My parents made me serve their VIP guest, not knowing he calls me boss. That night began with the humiliating rustle of starched linen as my mother tied a crisp white apron around my waist. They wanted me to be invisible, just another part of the household staff, serving champagne to the man they believed was their last hope. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. The powerful investor they were about to beg for a lifeline was the same man who, just last week, sat across from me in my New York office. The same man who answers to me. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. That's when I decided I wasn't just going to serve him dinner, I was going to serve them justice. To the outside world, and especially in our elite Boston circle, we were the Sterlings. Perfect, polished, and powerful. My father, Richard, a man who wore his family name like a suit of armor, and my mother, Eleanor, a woman whose smile was as sharp and pristine as the diamonds on her fingers. And there was me, Chloe, quiet, agreeable daughter. The one with the cute little tech hobby that they'd pat me on the head for, never once asking what my company, Sterling Innovations, actually did. For years I played my part. I smiled at the galas, kept my opinions to myself at the dinner table, and never, ever challenged the image they so carefully crafted. It was easier that way. Keeping the peace felt like a small price to pay for what I thought was their love. But that night, the price became too high. This is the story of how I stopped being their daughter and started being their reckoning. It's a story about a betrayal that cuts deeper than any knife, and about how I took back my name, future, and my power, one devastating truth at a time. This story isn't an easy one to tell alone, so if you want to see how it all unfolded, make sure you're following along. You won't want to miss what happened when the champagne flutes were empty and the masks came off. The house didn't feel like my home that night. It felt like a stage. And I was just a prop. The air was thick with the scent of lilies. My mother's choice for evenings of important so heavy and sweet it was almost suffocating. I could hear the low hum of the caterer, a sound that was usually a comfort but now felt like a reminder of my place. My role was simple. Be seen, but not truly noticed. Smile, pour the drinks, and stay out of the way of the real adults. My mother found me in the hallway, adjusting a painting that was already perfectly straight. She didn't look at me. Her eyes were scanning the grand foyer, calculating, searching for imperfections. She told me the silver coasters in the dining room weren't good enough. The special ones, the heavy, ornate ones my grandmother brought from England, were in the credenza in my father's office. I remember she didn't ask me to get them, she instructed me, her tone the same one she used with the gardener. The door to my father's office was heavy oak, and it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open just enough to slip inside. The room smelled of old leather, wood polish, and my father's faint, spicy cologne. It was the smell of power, of the sterling legacy he was so proud of. But as I reached for the cabinet handle, I heard their voices from the adjoining study, low and urgent. My blood went cold. It was my father's voice first, but stripped of its usual booming confidence. It was thin, ragged. I heard him tell my mother that he'd moved the last of the funds from some account I'd never heard of. He said it was just enough to keep the lights on for another month, maybe 2. Then her voice, sharp and brittle, like ice cracking. She said that everything depended on tonight. Everything depended on Marcus Thorne. She told my father he had to be charming, convincing, because if Marcus didn't sign, if he didn't invest in their fabricated portfolio of success, they weren't just in trouble. I heard the exact word she used. A venomous whisper that seemed to suck all the air out of the ruin. My father then said something that stopped my heart. He asked if she was sure I didn't suspect it. He used my name, Chloe, and it felt like a betrayal. My mother's laugh was short. She told him I was too busy with my little computer hobby to notice the real world, that I still believed in the fantasy they'd built for my own. I stood there, hidden in the shadows of the office, the cold metal of the coaster handle digging into my palm. For my entire life, I had been told the Sterling name was bedrock, a fortress of wealth and influence. My father's favorite phrase at every holiday was a toast to a legacy that will endure for generations. It was all a lie. The fortress was a house of cards. The bedrock was sand, and they thought I was a fool. A knot of something hot and painful tightened in my throat. I grabbed the coasters, my hands shaking so badly they clinked together, a tiny telltale sound. I held my breath, but they didn't. I walked back into the blindingly bright hallway, my face a carefully constructed mask of calm. I placed the coasters on the table just as the doorbell rang. Marcus Thorne was exactly as I remembered from our board meetings. Tall, impeccably dressed, with eyes that missed nothing. He stepped into the foyer, and his gaze swept the room before landing on me. I was holding a silver tray of champagne flutes. For a single terrifying second, I saw it all in his eyes. Shock, confusion, recognition. I saw the question forming on his lips, but just as quickly it was gone, replaced by the polite, unreadable expression of a guest. He was a professional. He wouldn't blow my cover. But in that split second, the secret we shared hung in the air between us, a live wire in a room full of gunpowder. Then my father, oblivious, stepped forward, his arm sweeping out in a grand gesture. He introduced me. He didn't say, "This is my daughter, Chloe, CEO of Sterling Innovations." He smiled his big, charming smile and told Marcus, "And this is our dear Chloe, who's being such a wonderful help to us tonight." He patted my shoulder, a gesture meant to look affectionate, but that felt like a dismissal. He was branding me in front of the one man who knew my worth as nothing more than the help. That night, standing in my childhood home in a servant's apron, I realized my parents weren't just liars. They were strangers, and I was going to find out exactly who they were. My father's dismissal was meant to be an insult, but it became my armor. The moment I was just the help, I became invisible, and from that point on, my invisibility was my greatest weapon. I moved through the evening in a state of hyper-awareness, every sense on fire. My apron, once a symbol of humiliation, now felt like a disguise, a cloak that let me move through my own home as a spy. The dinner was a master class in deception. I floated around the grand mahogany table, refilling wine glasses, my movements silent and precise. I listened as my father pontificated about investment strategies, using words like bull market and aggressive growth, his voice full of a confidence I now knew was a complete sham. I watched my mother laugh, a tinkling melodic sound she reserved for company as she recounted a recent charity auction, implying a donation so large it made my stomach turn. They were magnificent actors. They built a world of glittering lies around Marcus, and he sat at the center of it, his face a mask of polite interest. But I knew him. I saw the way his eyes would linger for a fraction of a second too long on my father's face after a particularly bold claim, the subtle tightening of his jaw. He was listening, but he wasn't buying it. My chance came after the main course. My mother, with a wave of her hand, suggested coffee and cognac in the study. She told me to prepare a tray. This was it. This was my window. My heart hammered against my ribs as I walked toward the kitchen, but I bypassed it, heading straight for the oak door to my father's office. The house was quiet in this wing, the sound of the dinner party a distant murmur. Every step I took felt unnervingly loud on the antique floorboards. I slipped inside the office, the smell of leather and lies thicker than ever. I didn't have much time. My first instinct was his desk. The main drawer, where he kept his important documents, was locked. A wave of panic washed over me. Of course it was locked. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think. Where would he put something he needed for the evening? Something he thought was safe. My eyes scanned the room and landed on his leather briefcase, propped against the leg of his desk. He must have been reviewing his pitch before Marcus arrived. My fingers fumbled with the cold brass latches. They sprang open with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Inside, beneath a sheaf of meaningless market reports, was a slim, dark blue portfolio. My hands were trembling as I opened it. The first documents were bank statements for the family accounts. The numbers were terrifying. They were hemorrhaging money, with balances so low they wouldn't even cover the catering bill for tonight. Then I saw the statements for another account. An account in my name, the Sterling Trust. I trust. The one my grandfather had set up for me, his voice a warm memory in my ear telling me this would always keep me safe, always give me my own ground to stand on. The statements showed a history of systematic withdrawals, large sums transferred to my father's failing accounts. He'd been using my safety net to plug the holes in his sinking ship, all while telling me my hobby was cute. Nausea rose in my throat, hot and acidic, but it got worse. At the very back of the portfolio was the final devastating blow. It was a document titled Memorandum of Understanding. It was a preliminary agreement to sell a controlling interest in a portfolio of high-value commercial real estate properties in downtown Boston. I recognized the addresses instantly. They were the cornerstones of my grandfather's trust, my properties. And listed under the section Prospective Buyer was a name that made the world tilt on its axis. Marcus Thorne. They weren't just stealing from me. They were trying to sell my entire future, the legacy my grandfather had so carefully built to protect me, and they were trying to sell it to my own employee. The betrayal was so absolute, so profound, it stole my breath. I couldn't take the papers, but I had my phone. My hands shook violently as I pulled it out, my thumb barely able to unlock the screen. I flattened each page on the desk, the glossy paper cool beneath my trembling fingers, and I took a photo of every single one. The systematic theft, the lies, the sales agreement with Marcus's name on it. Click, click, click. Each soft sound was a nail in their coffin. I had just slipped the phone back into my apron pocket when I heard footsteps approaching. I shoved the portfolio back into the briefcase, snapped the latches shut, and stood up, turning away from the desk just as the office door swung open. It was my father. He smiled at me, a warm, paternal smile that didn't reach his eyes. He asked if the coffee was ready, his voice smooth as silk. I had to force the corners of my own mouth to turn up, to nod, to tell him I was just on my way to get it, all while the digital proof of his monstrous betrayal was burning a hole in my pocket. As I looked into the eyes of the man who raised me, I finally understood. The most dangerous person in my life wasn't some stranger in the dark. It was the man I called Dad. Walking out of that office felt like surfacing from underwater. The sounds of the dinner party rushed back in, the murmur of voices, the clink of glasses, but they sounded distant, distorted, like a memory of a life I was no longer living. In my pocket, my phone felt as heavy as a stone, a cold, hard repository of the truth. I had to get through the rest of the night. I had to prepare the coffee. Every movement was automated. I remember the hiss of the espresso machine, the rich, dark smell of the coffee beans, the weight of the porcelain cups on the silver tray. My hands were steady, a strange disconnect from the maelstrom inside me. I was an actress now, playing the part of myself, the dutiful daughter, the helpful host. As I carried the tray back towards the study, I could feel the invisible mask I was wearing hardening on my face, a fragile shield between me and the two men who were waiting. I found them in the study with the cognac. My father was leaning back in his leather chair, swirling the amber liquid in his glass, looking at himself. Marcus was sitting opposite, his posture calm but attentive. I placed the tray on the My father didn't even look. He told me that was all, that I could go. But before I could, Marcus spoke. He directed his question to me, his voice even and professional. He said he'd been meaning to ask about the estate's network infrastructure, that he was having trouble with his own, and had heard I knew a thing or two about tech. It was a brilliant move. My father, caught off guard, couldn't possibly refuse the guest of honor a simple question. He looked momentarily irritated at my continued presence, but, desperate to stay in Marcus's good graces, he simply waved a hand and told me to answer the man's question. Then Marcus added a final, masterful stroke. He told my father that his questions might get a bit technical, and he wouldn't want to bore him with the details. It was a polite dismissal my father couldn't refuse. He beamed, seeing it as a sign the two men were bonding. He said he had to check on the other guests anyway, and left the room, closing the heavy doors behind him. We were alone. The moment the latch clicked, the professional mask on Marcus's face fell away, replaced by one of deep concern. He kept his voice low, telling me he knew something was wrong from the moment he saw me with that tray. He asked what was happening. I didn't have to show him the pictures on my phone. The truth he delivered was far worse than what I had discovered. He told me, his words careful and precise, exactly what my parents had offered. It wasn't just a piece of my portfolio. It was a controlling majority. They were trying to sell the whole thing out from. He told me how they had justified it. He said they painted a picture of me for him. They told him their daughter, Chloe, was troubled. That I was creative and bright, of course, but that I had no head for business, no grasp of the real world. They used words like flighty and unstable. He said my mother had looked into tearful eyes and told him they were terrified I would squander my inheritance on my silly projects. They explained that they were managing my trust for my own protection. They told him that selling a majority stake to a stable, experienced investor like him wasn't about their own needs. It was about securing my future. It was, they claimed, the only responsible thing to do as loving parents. The air left my lungs. This was the depth of the well, the breathtaking, bottomless cruelty of their plan. They weren't just stealing my inheritance. They were trying to steal my every late night I'd spent building my company, every deal I'd closed, every success I had earned on my own terms. They were erasing it all, rewriting my life into a narrative of a helpless little girl who needed saving. The condescending pats on the head, the dismissive comments about my hobby. It was all part of it. It was a calculated campaign to build a fiction they could sell. The grief I felt in my father's office was a sharp stabbing. This was different. This was a cold, spreading poison. They hadn't just betrayed me. They had tried to unmake me. In that moment, listening to Marcus detail their elaborate, cruel fiction, the hurt in my chest didn't break me. It forged me into something new, something sharp, something they would never see. When the study door closed behind my father, I looked at Marcus. First time that night, I let the mask drop. Fury and the hurt must have been plain on my face. Before he could say another word, I took out my phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I showed him the photos, the bank statements, the systematic withdrawals from my trust, and the preliminary sales agreement with his name on it. His jaw tightened as he swiped through the images. I saw a flicker of professional anger in his eyes, the look of a man who hates being played for a fool. When he looked up, the concern was still there, but it was overlaid with a new respect. I wasn't the server in the apron anymore. I was Chloe Sterling, CEO of Sterling Innovations, his boss, and the victim of a multi-million-dollar fraud. We were now on the same side, not just out of loyalty, but out of principle. Our plan was forged in whispers in the 2 minutes we had. He would play along. He would express serious interest in their proposal, drawing out the negotiations to buy me time. I, in turn, would play my part. The naive, clueless daughter, easily impressed and easily dismissed. We were now co-conspirators, allies in a war my parents didn't even know had been declared. When my father knocked and re-entered the room, I had already morphed back into the character they expected me to be. I stood up, looking slightly flushed and overwhelmed. My father looked from me to Marcus, his eyes alight with a greedy, hopeful curiosity. He asked what we had been discussing for so long. I forced a shy smile and told him Mr. Thorne was just being very nice, asking all about my little website business. The words felt like ash in my mouth, but they were exactly what he wanted to hear. His smile broadened. It was working. He saw me as a charming, silly distraction, a final little hurdle before he closed the deal of a lifetime. He patted my head, a gesture of ownership, and told me I'd done a good job not boring their important guest. The rest of the evening was an exercise in supreme self-control. I watched them, my parents, with new eyes. I saw the way my father's hand rested possessively on the back of Marcus's chair. I saw the triumphant glint in my mother's eyes every time Marcus gave a non-committal but encouraging nod. They were so close to getting everything they wanted, they were practically vibrating with suppressed excitement, and their confidence made them careless. The slip-up, when it came, was from my mother. Marcus was at the door, making his final goodbyes. My father was shaking his hand for an uncomfortably long time, talking about setting up a formal meeting. My mother, giddy with her perceived success, looped her arm through mine, pulling me into a hug that felt more like a vice. Her diamond rings dug into my skin. She leaned in close, her breath smelling of champagne and victory. She whispered that she was so proud of me for being such a good hostess. Then she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, that soon all of this would be over. She told me I wouldn't have to worry my pretty little head about any of these complicated business matters for much longer. And then came the fatal mistake. She said that once the deal with Marcus was signed, they'd have me sign a few papers. Just some simple things, she'd explained, to give them power of attorney to streamline my portfolio. It would be so much easier, she'd cooed. They could handle everything, and I'd be completely taken care of, maybe in a lovely little condo downtown where I could focus on my art, or whatever it was I wanted to do. Power of attorney. The two words hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just about selling my assets anymore. This was their end game. They wanted to trick me into signing away legal control of my entire life. My finances, my company, my future. They wanted to put me in a gilded cage, rendering me utterly powerless, all under the guise of taking care of their fragile, flighty daughter. Somehow, I found my voice. I looked at her, my eyes wide with the feigned innocence she expected, and told her that sounded wonderful. I said it would be such a relief. I saw the final knot of tension release from her shoulders. She had won. Power of attorney. The words echoed in my head as I watched their car pull away. They weren't just building it, they were trying to trick me into walking into it and locking the door myself. And in her arrogance, my mother had disability. I went back to my old bed, the room I grew up in. It felt like a museum of a life that belonged to someone else. The photos on the wall of a cruel joke. The trophies from my high school debate team felt like relics from an ancient civilization. I sat on the edge of the bed, the silence of the house pressing in on me, broken only by the faint, muffled sound of my parents' laughter drifting up from the living room. They were celebrating, toasting to their success, toasting to the sale of. The question wasn't just what and it was why. The numbers didn't add up to this level of cruelty. Being broke could make people desperate. But this was a meticulous campaign of character assassination paired with grand larceny against their own child. It was personal, and to defeat them, to truly understand the enemy, I had to understand the root of their hate. My cute little hobby was about to become their nightmare. I opened my laptop, the soft blue light chasing away the shadows in the room. They were careless with their digital lives, always relying on me to set up their networks, their cloud storage, their passwords. They saw technology as a utility, like electricity or water. They never saw it as a weapon. They never saw it as a vault, filled with every secret they'd ever tried to bury. I started with the family cloud drive. It was a digital attic, filled with years of disorganized files they thought were unimportant. Old tax returns, scanned photos, Christmas card lists. I sifted through years of digital dust, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I was looking for a fracture point, a timeline of when things started to go wrong. And then I found it. It was a folder, mislabeled Summer Renovations 2007, the year before my grandfather passed away. Inside weren't pictures of kitchen tiles or paint swatches. It was a single scanned PDF. Last Will and Testament of George Sterling, draft. My heart began to pound. It wasn't his final will. This was an earlier version. I opened the file. The legal language was dense, but the meaning was brutally clear. In this version, my grandfather, George Sterling, left everything to his only son, my father, Richard. The company, the properties, the entire Sterling fortune. In this will, I was an afterthought, given a small educational stipend and nothing more. My father was supposed to be the sole heir, the king. A cold dread washed over me. I kept digging in another folder labeled MISC Correspondence. I found a scanned letter. It was from my grandfather to my father. The date was just 3 months before his death, long after that first draft of the will was written. The letter was heartbreaking. My grandfather wrote with a heavy heart about his disappointment in my father's reckless business deals, the flashy risks he took, the way he valued the appearance of success over the hard work of building. He wrote that he feared my father would burn the entire Sterling legacy to the ground within a decade. But then the letter shifted. He started writing about me. He wrote about watching me, his quiet granddaughter, the one who preferred books and computers to parties. He mentioned a conversation we'd had about a tech startup, how I'd broken down its business model with a clarity that amazed him. He saw his own pragmatism, his own vision in me. He wrote that leaving the core assets, the real estate portfolio, the untouchable trust, to me was the hardest decision of his life. It wasn't to punish my father, he explained, but to protect the family. He was making me the custodian of their future, was choosing. The screen blurred. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. It was never just about money. It was about my father's wounded pride. Every success I had, every milestone my company achieved, wasn't a source of pride for him. It was a screaming reminder that his own father had deemed him a failure. His own daughter had been chosen over him. Their entire plan to steal my assets, to have me declared incompetent via a power of attorney, it was all a twisted, desperate attempt to retroactively prove my grandfather wrong. They needed to show the world that I was the flighty, unstable one, that he, Richard Sterling, was the true and deserving heir who had to step in and save the family from the foolish girl his father had mistakenly trusted. The letter was a testament, and the final will was a verdict. My grandfather had chosen me. My father's entire scheme was a desperate, childish attempt to reverse that judgment. He didn't understand. You can't steal a legacy. You have to earn it. And his was about to be officially revoked. Dawn broke, painting the windows of my bedroom shades of gray, and I hadn't slept. I had spent the night staring at my grandfather's letter on my laptop screen, the words burning themselves into my memory. Understanding my father's motivation didn't bring me peace. It brought a chill. His weakness wasn't financial, it was his ego. His entire life had been a performance to win the approval of a man who was no longer there to give it. And that meant my response couldn't be a quiet intervention. It had to be a public, undeniable, and legally binding refutation of his entire narrative. It had to be a judgment. For that, I needed a lawyer, not one of the slick corporate attorneys my father kept on retainer. They were his men. I needed someone loyal to my grandfather's legacy, and that meant there was only one name: David Chen. David was a legal prodigy my grandfather had taken under his wing years ago. He was young, brilliant, and saw the law not just as a profession, but as a system of order and justice. He wasn't just my grandfather's lawyer, he was his confidant. He was the one who helped draft the final will, the one who understood every clause and every intention behind it. If anyone would help me protect my grandfather's legacy, it was David. Getting to him was the first challenge. I couldn't make a call from the house. I couldn't risk a single misplaced word being overheard. At 6 a.m., I pulled on running clothes, my sneakers silent on the plush hallway carpet. I slipped past my parents' bedroom, their door firmly shut, and crept down the grand staircase. Every creak of the old wood sounded like a thunderclap to my own ears. I held my breath, eased open the heavy front door, and slipped out into the cool, damp morning air, my phone clutched in my hand. I didn't stop running for 3 blocks before I finally felt safe enough to call him. An hour later, I was in his office. It was a world away from the Sterling mansion. It was a small, practical space in a modest downtown building, smelling of strong coffee and old paper. The walls were lined with books, not awards. David listened, his face impassive, as the entire story poured out of me. The dinner party, the overheard conversation, the briefcase, the power of attorney, and finally, the 2 wills and my grandfather's letter. I showed him the photos on my phone, the evidence of their systematic theft. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the picture of the sales agreement. Then he looked at me, and his expression wasn't but of a cold, controlled anger. He told me that what my parents were doing wasn't just immoral, it was a profound breach of their fiduciary, and it was deeply illegal. Then he leaned forward and gave me the weapon I didn't even know I had. He told me my grandfather was but he was not he knew his son's character. He told me that when he and my grandfather had structured the final trust, my grandfather had insisted on a special provision, a failsafe he hoped would never be. David called it the fiduciary misconduct clause. The words themselves were a lifeline. David explained that the clause was crystal clear. If the administrators of the trust, my parents, were ever found to be acting in a way that was a clear conflict of interest, if they leveraged the trust's assets for their own personal, or if they attempted to coerce me into signing over any form of control, I had the sole unilateral right to remove them. Effective, no court battle, no lengthy fight, just a simple legally binding notification. He told me the clause also triggered something else, a mandatory full forensic audit of the trust's accounts, going back to the first day they took control. They wouldn't be able to hide a single penny they had stolen. It was a silver bullet, a weapon my grandfather had forged and hidden for me years ago, waiting for the day I might need it. He hadn't just left me his money, he had left me his protection. David said he would begin drafting the revocation documents immediately. My job, he explained, was to continue playing the part. Let them walk deeper into their own trap. All we needed was the right moment to spring it. David told me the clause was my grandfather's last gift to me, a shield. But looking at the paperwork he was starting to outline on his legal pad, I knew it wasn't a shield. It was a sword. The days following the dinner party were the most suffocating of my life. I was living in a viper pit, and my only defense was to pretend I was one of them. The house, which had once felt large and empty, now felt claustrophobic, every conversation a minefield, every shared meal a performance. My parents were insufferable. Drunk on the belief that their salvation was imminent, they became overly, sickeningly affectionate. My mother would constantly touch my hair, telling me how much more relaxed I seemed. My father would try to engage me in conversations about the stock market, explaining basic concepts with a patronizing air, as if I were a child just learning to count. They were already playing their roles as my benevolent guardians. All the while, they'd take hushed, excited calls from their lawyers in the other room, talking about finalizing the Thorne agreement. I played my part, smiling sweetly, nodding along, even asking a few naive questions about the nice condo they had planned for me to really sell my blissful ignorance. Behind the scenes, the gears of my own plan were turning. Marcus was a masterful ally. He sent me encrypted updates daily. He was a ghost, dangling the ultimate prize just out of my parents' reach. He'd tell them his legal team had found a minor issue that needed clarification. Then, he'd say he needed to fly to London to move some capital. He was creating a state of prolonged, desperate anticipation, ensuring that when they finally believed the deal was done, their guard would be completely down. At the same time, David Chen worked silently, methodically. He sent me a password-protected file. It contained the finalized legal documents, the notices of immediate revocation of administrative powers. They were the digital cannons, aimed and ready, waiting only for my signal to fire. I had the motive, the evidence, the ally, and the weapon. All I needed was the right battlefield. A quiet legal filing would remove them, but it wouldn't deliver the justice their betrayal demanded. The punishment had to be as public as the lie they lived. They had built their reputation in the glittering ballrooms and exclusive clubs of Boston. It was only fitting that I'd tear it down in the same arena. The opportunity, when it arrived, was poetic. My mother, in a state of giddy excitement, came to my room one afternoon. She reminded me that the annual Sterling Family Foundation Gala was in a week. It was their crown jewel, the biggest charity event of the year, where the old money families of Boston gathered to write checks and applaud each other's generosity. For my father, it was his favorite night of the year. The climax of the evening was always his grand keynote speech, a 20-minute performance where he would speak about family, honor, and the Sterling legacy before announcing the foundation's major charitable donation. It was the very pinnacle of his public persona, and just like that, I saw it. The perfect stage. A few days later, I went to my mother. I put on my best performance yet, my voice filled with a newfound earnest enthusiasm. I told her that my father's recent business discussions with Mr. Thorne had been so inspiring. I told her I finally understood the importance of the family's work and that I wanted to do my part. I asked her if at the gala I could perhaps say a few words, maybe make a surprise announcement of my own, a personal contribution to the foundation. Her face lit up with a blinding, triumphant smile. This was the moment she had been waiting for. Her flighty, distracted daughter was finally embracing the Sterling way. She thought I was finally becoming the puppet she could proudly display. She kissed my forehead and told me it was a wonderful idea. She said she would arrange it with the event coordinator. She would have them put a moment for me in the program, right after my father's speech. In her mind, she was setting the stage for my debut into their society. She had no idea she was orchestrating her own execution. The night of the gala arrived. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, dressed in a sleek, dark gown that felt more like armor than couture. I could hear the murmur of the guests arriving downstairs, the clink of champagne glasses. Marcus had already confirmed he was on his way, telling my father he was looking forward to celebrating a successful partnership. The trap was set. My parents were at the absolute peak of their hubris. Tonight, my father would stand on a stage and talk about the Sterling legacy. He thought he was giving a speech. I knew he was delivering his own eulogy. And I was the one who had written it. Walking into the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Copley Plaza was like stepping into a constellation of shimmering lights and whispered secrets. The air was thick with the scent of 1,000 flowers and the weight of old money. A string quartet played softly in the corner, a delicate soundtrack to the polite, predatory dance of Boston's elite. To them, this was the social event of the season. To me, it was an arena, and I had just stepped onto the sand. My father was in his element. He moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of a man who believed in his own myth, a firm handshake for the men, a charming, disarming smile for the women. My mother was his shadow, a vision in emerald silk, her laughter a carefully calibrated performance. They paraded me around with a new, suffocating pride. They would introduce me to their friends, old banking tycoons and their wives, telling them all that I was making a very special announcement tonight. They kept saying how proud they were that I was finally stepping up. The praise felt like a physical illness. They were celebrating my surrender, completely oblivious to the fact that I was preparing for war. I saw Marcus near the bar, looking out of place and utterly at ease at the same time. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement. My father, spotting him, immediately steered me in his direction, puffing up with pride. He clapped Marcus on the shoulder, his voice booming. Marcus simply smiled, took my hand, and told me, his voice just for me, that he was very much looking forward to my speech. It was a quiet promise of support, a final confirmation from my ally before the battle began. My father, of course, heard it as a compliment to himself, proof that even the New York hotshot was impressed with his family. I needed a moment, a breath of air away from the suffocating hypocrisy. I excused myself, heading toward the back of the ballroom. As I passed a heavy velvet curtain leading to a service corridor, I heard their voices. Low, tense, and stripped of all their public charm. It was my parents. Froze, pressing myself into the shadows of the alcove. It was my father's voice. Laced with a panic he was telling her that Marcus was being non-committal, that he was worried something was wrong. His confidence was a fragile shell, and it was cracking. My mother's reply was a venomous hiss. She told him to get a hold of himself, to stop looking so desperate. She said that her entire life had been a series of sacrifices to maintain his image, to prop up the sterling name he so carelessly damaged, and that he would not fall apart now. Not when they were this close. Then came the slip. The final piece of the puzzle I didn't even know I was missing. My father, his voice a ragged whisper, asked what would happen if the deal fell through. He asked how they would cover the other mortgages, the ones on the mansion. My mother cut him off, her voice like ice, telling him to never speak of that again. So that was it. The depth of their desperation was even greater than I had imagined. They hadn't just drained my trust and gambled away they had leveraged everything they had left, down to the roof over their heads. Their grand performance tonight wasn't just about social standing, it was about survival, and I finally understood. Their alliance wasn't one of strength and partnership. It was a terrified, codependent pact between a weak man and the resentful woman who enabled him. Underneath the diamonds and designer suits, they were just as fragile as the house of cards they had built. I slipped away, my heart beating a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. The last bit of fear I had was gone, replaced by a cold, absolute certainty. I was not fighting giants. I was fighting two terrified, hollow people who were about to be exposed to the light. I found my seat just as the lights in the ballroom began to dim. The master of ceremonies walked onto the stage, his voice echoing through the silent room. He spoke of charity, of legacy, and of one of Boston's great families. And then he said the words I had been waiting for. Please join me in welcoming the chairman of the Sterling Foundation, Mr. Richard Sterling. The announcer called his name, and the room applauded. They were applauding a ghost, a fiction my parents had built out of lies and my inheritance. I took a deep breath. It was time to introduce them to... My father walked onto that stage like a Roman emperor entering the Colosseum. The spotlight found him, bathing him in a halo of undeserved brilliance. He gripped the sides of the podium, a gesture he thought made him look powerful and commanding. He smiled, a wide, practiced smile that had sold lies for 30 years, and the room fell silent for him. He began to speak. His voice, rich and resonant, filled the ballroom. He spoke about legacy, about the duty of one generation to build a foundation for the next. He used the word trust no less than 5 times, and with each one I felt a cold, hard knot tighten in my stomach. He talked about the Sterling family's unwavering commitment to the city of Boston. He spoke of honor and integrity. It was the greatest performance of his life, a masterpiece of hypocrisy. I sat perfectly still at my table, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the gazes of everyone around me. They saw an adoring daughter. I was a spectator at a crime scene, watching the murderer lovingly describe his victim. He was building to his crescendo. He spoke of a bright future, of new partnerships and bold ventures that would secure the Sterling legacy for decades to come. He looked out over the crowd and his eyes found Marcus. He gave a knowing, confident nod, a public signal to the entire room that a great victory had been won. The applause was thunderous. He had them completely under his spell. Then he smiled at me. He raised his hand and beckoned me to the stage. He announced to the room that his darling daughter, Chloe, had a few words to share. He told them how proud he was of the woman I was becoming. He was the benevolent patriarch, passing the torch, cementing the image of a perfect, unified family. He handed me the microphone, his hand brushing mine, and his skin was cold with sweat. He thought he was handing me a prop. He had no idea he was handing me a sword. The walk to the center of the stage felt 100 miles long. The heat of the lights was blinding. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my mother in the front row, her hands clasped together, her face a perfect portrait of maternal pride. I could see my father standing just behind me, his chest puffed out. And I could see Marcus, his expression unreadable, a calm island in a sea of deception. I took my place at the podium. The room was silent, waiting. I started soft. I thanked my father for his generous introduction, my voice even and clear. I thanked everyone for attending, for supporting the foundation's work. It was all according to their script. Tonight, I continued, my voice gaining strength, I want to talk about the same things my father spoke of: family, trust, and legacy. But I want to talk about what those words a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. I had their full attention. As some of you know, I said, my eyes scanning the front rows. My grandfather, George Sterling, left me a significant trust, for which my parents, Richard and Eleanor Sterling, have served as administrators. I saw my father's smile tighten ever so slightly. This was not in the approved script. What you don't know, I said, my voice now as sharp and cold as steel, is that my grandfather was a wise man. He built a protection into the trust's charter, a specific provision called the Fiduciary Misconduct Clause. The silence in the room became absolute, heavy, and unnatural. My parents froze. That clause states, I explained, my voice echoing in the cavernous space, that if the administrators are ever found to be acting against the beneficiary's best interests, embezzling funds, or attempting to fraudulently sell the trust's assets, the beneficiary has the sole and unilateral right to remove them. Effective immediately. I let the words hang in the air for a moment. Then, I looked directly at my parents. And tonight, I am formally invoking that clause. A collective gasp went through the audience. My mother's face went white. My father looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. For years, I continued, turning now to the shocked faces of the crowd, my parents have been systematically embezzling funds from my trust to cover their own catastrophic financial failures. And this past week, they attempted to fraudulently sell a controlling interest in my real estate portfolio. As I spoke, the two large screens on either side of the stage, which had been displaying the foundation's logo, flickered to life. On them appeared the crystal-clear images from my phone, the bank statements showing the transfers, and the sales agreement with my parents' forged signatures, offering my assets to Marcus Thorne. Murmurs erupted throughout the ballroom, growing into a roar of shock and disbelief. They did this, I said, my voice cutting through the noise, by telling their prospective buyer that I was mentally unstable and incompetent to manage my own affairs. I looked at Marcus. I would like to publicly thank Mr. Thorne for his integrity, because unlike my parents, he is a man of honor, and he brought this criminal behavior to my attention. I turned back to the podium for the final blow. Therefore, as the new sole administrator of the Sterling Trust, my first official act is this. I am immediately revoking my parents' access to all family accounts and properties. Secondly, I am personally redirecting the foundation's entire annual endowment. It will not be going to my father's vanity projects. Instead, it will be a multi-million-dollar grant to fund a tech incubator for female entrepreneurs here in Boston. Because unlike my father, I believe a woman's cute little hobby can change the world. I took a breath. And finally, a formal notice of your immediate removal, along with all of this evidence, has just been delivered to your inboxes from my lawyer, David Chen. A copy has also been sent to the office of the district attorney. I placed the microphone back on its stand. A click echoed through the ballroom, which had fallen into a deafening, horrified silence. The spotlight was still on us. Cruel eye. My father's face was slack, his mouth open, the mask of the great Richard Sterling shattered into a million pieces. My mother looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped on a marble, perfect face, a canvas of pure, unadulterated. They were frozen, exposed, and utterly, publicly ruined. I looked at them one last, not with hate, but with a strange, chilling. They were no longer my parents. They were just criminals. And then I turned my back on them and walked off the stage. The moment I stepped off that stage, the world exploded. The deafening silence was shattered by a tidal wave of noise. Gasps, hundreds of people talking at once, the frantic clicking of phone cameras. The air crackled with scandal. It was the exact moment a dynasty died, and everyone in that room knew they were witnessing it. They stared at me as I walked through the ballroom, my face a calm mask. I wasn't looking at any of them. My eyes were fixed on the... Marcus met me by the grand doors. Just as he didn't say a word. He simply put a steadying hand on my back and guided me through a side door and away from the smoke. As the car pulled away, I glanced back at the hotel. See the flash hands already. The story was out of my hands now, a wildfire spreading through the city. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound and terrifying sense of quiet, of a war. I never spoke to my parents again. I learned about their fate the same way the rest of the world did, through the headlines, The Sterling Foundation scandal was a media feeding frenzy. Their social ruin was immediate and absolute. The friends who had once clamored for their attention now crossed the street to avoid them. The invitations stopped. The memberships were revoked. They were ghosts in the city that had once been their kingdom. The legal consequences were even more brutal. The audit that my grandfather's clause triggered was a meticulous, brutal excavation of their crimes. It uncovered more than I ever could have, a decade of elaborate fraud and theft. They had mortgaged the house to the hilt. They had taken out loans against art they didn't own. They were hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt beyond what they had stolen from me. Faced with a mountain of undeniable evidence, they took a plea deal. The mansion was sold at auction. The paintings, the cars, the jewelry, all of it was liquidated to pay back a fraction of what they owed. Their empire had been a mirage, and I had been the one to turn on the lights. My own life, however, was just beginning. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings with David, with forensic accountants, with the new board of directors I was appointing for the foundation. For the first time, I walked into the offices of Sterling Innovations not as a quiet founder with a hobby, but as the undisputed leader of a rapidly growing tech firm and the sole controller of a vast financial portfolio. I was no longer playing a part. I was finally fully myself. We launched the incubator. The Sterling Grant for Women in Technology became my new legacy. I spent my days listening to pitches from brilliant, ambitious women, hearing their ideas to change the world, and I had the profound privilege of giving them the resources to. I was taking the money that my parents had tried to use to erase me, and instead, using it to make sure hundreds of other women would be seen. Months, the seasons in Boston changed. The anger that had fueled me for so long, slowly, quietly, burned itself out. What was left in its place was a kind of peace I had never known. One evening, I was working late in my own apartment, a clean, modern space that I had chosen and paid for, and I found myself opening the old file on my laptop. I read my grandfather's letter one last time, and that's when the final truth of my story settled in my heart. The real tragedy was not that my parents had betrayed, but that they had never really seen me at all. My father's resentment, his pathetic, lifelong need for his own father's approval, had blinded him. My mother's complicity in his lies had been her life's work. It was never about me. My success was just an inconvenient truth in the fiction they had built for themselves. My grandfather's real gift wasn't the trust fund, it was the trust he had placed in me. The money was just a tool. His faith was the true inheritance. And in finally choosing to have faith in myself, I had honored his legacy more than any fortune ever could. I forgave myself for all the years I spent making myself smaller to keep the peace. For not seeing the truth sooner, I closed the laptop, leaving the past where it belonged. This whole story started in a ballroom in Boston, but I know the feelings in it of being underestimated, of fighting for your own voice. Happen everywhere, in big cities and small towns. It's a strange comfort to know you're not alone on your journey. I'd actually love to know where you're listening from. If you feel comfortable, drop the name of your city in the comments. It's just nice to know we're all out here, writing our own endings. I have so many more stories waiting to be told. Stories of deep betrayals, unexpected strength, and the kind of justice you can't help but root for. If this journey resonated with you, and you want to make sure you're here for the next one, the best thing you can do is subscribe to the channel. It's the only way to guarantee you won't miss the first chapter when a new story begins. Consider it our pact to see these things through to the very end, together. My name is Chloe Sterling, and I am the architect of my own legacy.